House of Cañitas. Based on real stories. Story 1. The Séance and the Shadow Entity. My name is Carlos Vega, and what I'm about to tell you destroyed my life and the lives of everyone who was with me that night in 1982. There are things in this world that should remain dormant. Entities that should not be disturbed. We didn't know that. We were young, stupid, and thirsty for excitement. The House of Cañitas seemed like just another abandoned residence in the suburbs of Mexico City. Old, yes. Scary, perhaps. But nothing that suggested the hell it harbored inside. I remember it as if it were yesterday. The smell of mold embedded in the peeling walls. The windows covered with poorly nailed boards that allowed slivers of dusk light to penetrate the environment, creating elongated shadows across the dusty floor. Miguel, always the most skeptical and mocking of the group, was the one who suggested the séance. "Let's summon a spirit and record everything. It'll be hilarious," he said, laughing as he arranged the 6 chairs in a circle in the main room. Elena, his girlfriend, seemed hesitant, but eventually gave in as always. Raul, Diana, and Jorge were also with us, all as naive as I was. On our way there, an elderly man stopped us. I'll never forget his eyes, deep and frightened, when he saw us carrying candles and the improvised Ouija board. "Don't enter that house," he said, grabbing my arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "There's something in there that has been waiting for centuries for unwary souls. Something that is not of this world." Miguel laughed, calling him a crazy old man. I should have listened. We all should have. We easily broke in through the back door and set up our little ritual in the middle of the room. We lit the candles, forming a circle around us. The tension was palpable. Even Miguel, behind all his bravado, seemed nervous as he positioned the glass in the center of the board. "Any spirits present?" Elena asked with a trembling voice, as we all kept our fingers lightly resting on the glass. Nothing happened in the first few minutes. Then I felt it. We all felt it. The temperature dropped so rapidly that our breath formed small clouds of condensation. The candle flames, once steady, began to dance violently, projecting shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. "I think we have company," Jorge joked nervously. Miguel, impatient, decided to provoke. "If there's any spirit here, prove it. Or are you too cowardly to show yourself?" It was at that exact moment that all the candles went out simultaneously. The darkness that enveloped us wasn't natural. It was dense, suffocating. I felt as if I were submerged in a thick, cold liquid. "Very funny, Miguel." "Turn on the lights," Diana demanded, the fear evident in her voice. "It wasn't me," he replied, his voice strangely distant. I heard a sound impossible to describe, like a deep sigh amplified 1,000 times, reverberating through the walls. Then Miguel screamed. A scream that wasn't of fright, but of pure, primal pain. When Raul managed to light his lighter, the sight froze my blood. Miguel was suspended almost a meter off the ground, his body arched impossibly, as if an invisible force was holding him by the chest. Blood was flowing from his nose and eyes, which were widened in pure terror. Then, as if the invisible force had grown tired of playing, it hurled Miguel against the opposite wall with brutal violence. The sound of his bones cracking still echoes. In my nightmares, we ran to him, while a hysterical Diana screamed for help. Miguel was conscious, but something was wrong. Very wrong. His eyes, once brown, now had an unnatural yellowish glow. and he began to mutter words in a language none of us recognized. Guttural, ancient, as if his vocal cords weren't made to produce those sounds. "Let's get out of here. Now!" I shouted, as Jorge and I carried Miguel outside. As we ran to the car, I looked back only once. I swear I saw through the broken window on the second floor a pair of luminescent eyes watching our escape. Not human eyes. Something else. Something that recognized each of us in that instant. Something that learned our names. Miguel was taken to the hospital that night. The doctors diagnosed a nervous collapse, combined with severe contusions from the fall. He was hospitalized for 3 days, but when he left, he was no longer the same. The playful, skeptical Miguel had disappeared. In his place was a frightened, paranoid, and deeply disturbed man. "She follows me, Carlos," he told me in a whisper when I visited him a week after the incident. "When I close my eyes, I see those eyes watching me. She shows me things that are not of this world." I tried to convince him it was trauma, that his mind was processing the shock, but deep down, I felt it too. Small things at first. The feeling of being watched, peripheral shadows that disappeared when I turned my head. Vivid dreams where I returned to that house and went down to the basement we never got to explore. Then, 2 weeks after the incident, I found something on the bathroom mirror after getting out of the shower. Words written in the condensation, 1 soul for each candle. 6 candles, 6 souls. I called my mother to see, but by the time she arrived, the message had disappeared. I began to think I was going crazy. Elena was the first to show physical signs. She came to me crying, showing deep scratch marks on her back. 3 parallel lines as if huge claws had torn through her skin while she slept. "I dreamed of her, Carlos," she said between sobs. "A shadow with an almost human form, except for the eyes and the hands. Those hands had fingers that were too long, with claws instead of nails." Raul and Diana reported similar experiences. Jorge was the only one who seemed to escape unscathed, or at least that's what I thought until I received that call. It was almost midnight when my phone rang. Miguel's voice was unrecognizable, hoarse, desperate, broken by sobs. "Carlos, she's here, in my room. She's feeding on me, bit by bit. Come help me, please. I don't want to die alone." I drove like crazy to his apartment. The door was unlocked. I called for Miguel, but only silence answered me. I found him in the bedroom, sitting on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling in a catatonic state. His body was covered in sweat, and all color had drained from his face. "Miguel? Man, talk to me." I shook him by the shoulders, with no response. It was then that I noticed it. The temperature of the room. It must have been at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the apartment. And that smell, like rotten meat mixed with sulfur. As I picked up the phone to call an ambulance, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow on the wall, not cast by anything in the room, moving slowly as if sliding. It wasn't an ordinary shadow. It seemed to have density, substance, and as it moved, the smell grew stronger. The shadow paused, then a part of it stood out. 2 luminescent points that I immediately recognized as the same eyes I had seen in that house. They fixed on me, and I felt as if something icy wrapped around my heart. Then Miguel spoke. His voice wasn't his. It was deeper, with a supernatural echo, as if several voices were speaking in unison. "She collects souls, and now she knows our names. Suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, Miguel came to himself, screaming in panic, clinging to me like a frightened child. The shadow had disappeared, but I knew it hadn't gone away. It had just hidden. At the hospital, the doctors found nothing physically wrong with Miguel, apart from extreme exhaustion and dehydration. They wanted to keep him under psychiatric observation. Miguel begged me not to leave him alone. "She comes when I'm alone, Carlos," he whispered when the doctors left. "She whispers things about what she'll do to each of us, says that we were the ones who freed her and that our blood is the price." I promised I would return in the morning. It was the last time I saw Miguel alive. The next morning I found the hospital corridor in chaos. Doctors and nurses were running to Miguel's room. When I managed to get close, I saw his body being covered with a sheet. His face. I will never forget that expression. Eyes and mouth open in a silent scream, as if he had seen hell itself before dying. "Cardiac arrest during the night," the doctor informed me, confused. It doesn't make sense in someone so young and with no cardiac history. But I knew the truth. And apparently, so did the old pathologist who approached me in the corridor, away from the other doctors. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "In my 50 years of medicine, I've seen 3 cases like this. The heart simply stops, as if something had sucked the life out from the inside. The last case was 10 years ago, also connected to that house in Cañitas. I barely had time to process that information when I received the news. Elena had been found dead in her apartment. Same circumstances. No apparent cause. Expression of absolute terror. 2 days later, it was Raul. I began to research frantically, seeking information about the House of Cañitas, about entities that fed on souls, about how to protect myself. That's how I found Father Montez, a former exorcist who had specialized in pre-Columbian occultism. "What you released is not an ordinary spirit," he explained to me in his small apartment full of ancient books and religious artifacts. "It's an entity that the Aztecs called Black Tezcatlipoca, a corrupted aspect of one of their deities. It was imprisoned in that place by priests centuries ago, using sacrifice rituals that created a mystical seal. And we broke that seal," I concluded, feeling the weight of guilt. "Not completely. If you had broken it completely, the entity would have already physically manifested, and dozens would be dead. You just weakened the barrier. It can reach this world through shadows and dreams, feeding slowly. How do we stop it?" The priest's eyes fixed on mine, grave and heavy. "It's not a matter of stopping it, son. It's a matter of imprisoning it again. And for that, we need to return to the place where it was freed and perform a banishing ritual. But I warn you, the price may be high." That night, Jorge and Diana agreed to join me and the priest. They were the only survivors besides me, and both were desperate enough to try anything. The House of Cañitas seemed even more sinister at night. The priest instructed us to set up an improvised altar in the center of the room where it all began. Circles of salt, black candles, symbols drawn with a mixture of herbs and holy water. "No matter what you see or hear," he warned as he lit the candles. "Don't leave the protection circle until I finish the ritual." The priest began to recite in Latin, interspersing with words in Nahuatl, the ancient language of the Aztecs. With each word, the candle flames grew, changed color, from yellow to blue, from blue to an intense red. That's when the whispers began. Children's voices coming from all corners of the house, some crying, others laughing. Diana squeezed my hand tightly. "They're tricks," the priest warned without interrupting his prayers. "She wants to distract us." Then we saw it. The shadows on the walls began to move, to converge on a single point on the opposite wall. They merged, grew, until they formed a vaguely humanoid silhouette, except for the bright eyes and the limbs that were too long, ending in sharp claws. The temperature plummeted dramatically. Our breath formed dense clouds. Jorge began to tremble uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from pure terror. The shadow creature approached the circle, gliding like smoke. Its voice, when it spoke, seemed to come from within our own minds. "You freed me, and now you intend to imprison me again? I have your names, I have your flavors, I have your souls." The priest increased the volume of his prayers, but I could see the cold sweat on his forehead, the tremor in his hands. The entity came closer, its shadow claws extending toward the protective circle. That's when Father Montez let out an agonizing scream, clutching his chest. He fell to his knees, his face contorted in pain. "My heart," he gasped. "She's attacking me. From inside." Diana screamed when a shadow claw pierced the circle, grabbing the priest's ankle and dragging him outside. The protection. In seconds, the shadow enveloped his body. His scream was abruptly cut off, and when the shadow receded, the priest lay dead, his face frozen in the same expression of terror I had seen in Miguel. "The circle is broken," Jorge shouted, panicking. The entity grew, fed by the priest's death, filling the entire room with its shadowy presence. Its bright eyes now seemed like beacons in the darkness, fixed on the three of us. "You are mine," the voice whispered in our minds. That's when I saw the priest's book, fallen open on the ritual page. The final words, written in red, "Blood," I realized in horror, indicated the last step of the ritual. "Sanguis meus sigillum tuum," my blood, your seal. Without thinking twice, I took the priest's ritual dagger and cut deeply into my palm. Blood gushed over the altar, over the symbols. "I accept the sacrifice," I shouted, remembering the words that the priest had taught me as a last resort. My voluntary blood for the seal. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, not just physical but spiritual. I felt as if something was being torn from inside me. My vision darkened, my ears rang. I heard Jorge and Diana shouting my name, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. The entity let out an inhuman howl of rage. The shadows began to recede, being sucked into a point on the wall, a small fissure that I had never noticed before. The wind howled through the house, extinguishing the candles, leaving us in total darkness. When I finally managed to stand up, trembling and weak from blood loss, Jorge had already lit a flashlight. Diana was crying silently, still in shock. "Is it over?" Jorge asked, his voice breaking. I looked at the fissure in the wall. It seemed ordinary now, just a crack in the old plaster. But I knew better. "No," I replied honestly. "It's not over. We just pushed it back, for now. That was 40 years ago. Jorge killed himself 6 months later. He couldn't stand the nightmares, the constant voices. Diana moved to another country trying to escape, but they found her dead under mysterious circumstances 10 years later. Me? I survived. I carry the scars, not just the one on my hand, but the deeper ones, the invisible ones. I never married, never had children. I couldn't subject anyone to what I carry with me, because the truth is that she's still there, imprisoned but aware. And sometimes, when the night is particularly dark, I see those bright eyes watching me from the dark corners of my room. I hear the whispers, feel the supernatural cold. The ritual bought time, not victory. She promised to return, and I know that one day she will fulfill that promise. I just hope I'm not alive to see it. Story 2. The bright-eyed creature and the possessed doll. My name is Daniela Morales. I was an investigative journalist for 15 years, specializing in debunking urban legends and exposing paranormal frauds. Or at least that's what I used to. Do we say before the House of Cañitas, before the doll, before the eyes? It all started with an email from a viewer about the notorious House of Cañitas, suggesting that I investigate the accounts of Carlos Trejo, whom many considered a fraudster. Seeking fame, it was a perfect challenge for me. I had already exposed dozens of haunted houses and paranormal phenomena throughout my career. This would be just another one. As was my custom, I assembled a small team. Marco, my trusted cameraman, Elena, sound technician, and Gabriel, researcher and assistant. None of them are alive today to confirm what I'm about to relate. Only I survived, physically at least. This house has quite a history, Gabriel commented as we drove there, flipping through his notes. Pre-Columbian sacrifices at the site, unexplained deaths in 1982 after a séance, disappearances over the years. Carlos Trejo may have exaggerated, but there are police records of at least 5 mysterious deaths linked to the property. I rolled my eyes. There are always rational explanations. Probably carbon monoxide, infrasound, or an old house with faulty wiring causing hallucinations. And after Trejo published that book, of course more witnesses and victims emerged. The House of Cañitas had been rebuilt after a mysterious fire in the 90s, so I wasn't expecting much of the original structure. Still, as I parked in front of the place, I felt an involuntary shiver. The house was a 2-story structure, painted in a pale, sickly faded yellow that looked unhealthy in the late afternoon light. The windows, many with dark curtains drawn, resembled vigilant eyes. The current owner, a gentleman named Rodriguez, greeted us at the door. He rarely visited the property and maintained it only as an investment, occasionally renting it out for events, or, as in our case, for filming. As he showed us around, I noticed his discomfort. "You can film wherever you want, but I wouldn't sleep here," he commented as he handed over the keys. "And the basement? Well, it's locked. Compromised structure, you know? Dangerous. But we need complete access for our report," I insisted. "Including the basement." Rodriguez hesitated, then sighed deeply. "All right, but I'm not responsible for what happens down there. The basement key is on the key ring, the small bronze one." As soon as he left, we began setting up our equipment, placing cameras at strategic points throughout the house. I left the basement for last, feeling a growing curiosity about what Rodriguez was so reluctant to show. The basement door was hidden under a staircase, small and seemingly insignificant. The bronze key turned with difficulty in the rusty lock. When the door finally opened, a strange odor escaped. Not of mold or dampness as expected, but something older, like incense and oxidized copper. "This is strange," Marco commented as he turned on his flashlight. "This basement looks much older than the rest of the rebuilt house." He was right. While the rest of the house was visibly modern, the basement seemed to have survived the fire, intact. The walls were of ancient stone, the floor of packed earth. In the center was a stone column with worn carvings that appeared to be pre-Columbian symbols. "This is amazing," I murmured, examining the symbols. "This part could be an original Aztec structure." We walked around the basement, filming and documenting everything. That's when I noticed something in the darkest corner. a kind of niche in the wall where there was a dark wooden box sealed with red wax. "What do you think this is?" I asked. Marco, who pointed the camera at the box. "I don't know, but we shouldn't touch it," Elena commented, visibly uncomfortable. "This place gives me the creeps. We're investigative journalists, not teenagers in a horror movie," I scoffed. Although, something inside me agreed with her. Still, my curiosity won over instinct. I picked up the box, which was surprisingly light. The red wax sealing it had strange, impressed symbols, similar to those on the central column. Using my pocket knife, I cut the seal. "Are you sure?" Marco hesitated, lowering the camera momentarily. "Maybe we should research these symbols first." "It's just an old box, Marco. Probably some family memento or maybe a planted trick to give credibility to the stories." With those words, I opened the lid. Inside was an ancient doll. It wasn't an ordinary children's doll, but something more. Ritual, approximately 30 centimeters tall, made of dark cloth and clay, with small obsidian beads for eyes and hair that looked real. It was dressed in faded fabrics that had once been colorful, decorated with tiny embroidered symbols. "This looks like a ritual doll," Gabriel observed, fascinated. "Possibly used in pre-Columbian ceremonies." When I picked it up, an icy sensation ran through my body, as if I had plunged into freezing water. For an instant, so brief that I later doubted it had happened, the doll's black bead eyes seemed to glow with their own light. "Did you feel that?" Elena suddenly asked, adjusting her headphones. "What?" "A kind of whisper. I picked something up on the microphone." She rewound the recorder and turned up the volume. Through the static, we clearly heard a whisper in an unknown language, rhythmic like a distorted lullaby. "Probably interference," I suggested, although I knew our equipment was high quality and rarely failed. We took the doll with us, deciding it would be the central point of our documentation. I ignored the pang of guilt for removing something possibly historical from its original location, justifying that we would return it after the filming was completed. That night, staying at a small hotel nearby, I began to review the recordings. That's when I noticed something disturbing. In almost all the indoor shots, especially those in the basement, there was something in the darkest areas. 2 luminescent points, like eyes, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. "Marco, come see this," I called, feeling a knot form in my stomach. He looked at the screen, confused at first, then paled when he realized. "Are those eyes? From some animal, maybe?" "There's no way an animal could be in exactly the same place in different shots, from different angles," I replied, advancing through the recordings. The eyes were always there, always watching. Even more disturbing was the doll. I had placed it on the table in my room, but when reviewing the footage, I noticed that its position changed subtly between shots. The head turned a little more to the right, an arm moved a few centimeters. "It must be just an impression," I murmured to myself, looking back at the real doll on the table. Its black bead eyes reflected the lamplight, seeming to observe my every movement. I shook my head, laughing at my own imagination. It was just an old doll, a curious artifact. Nothing more. How wrong I was. I woke up before dawn, suffocated by a nightmare so vivid I could still feel its weight on me. In the dream, I was back in the basement, alone. The central column pulsed with its own light, and from the carved symbols flowed a dark liquid that formed puddles on the earth floor. The puddles moved, converging to form a humanoid silhouette, except for the eyes. Those same luminescent points from the recordings, and for abnormally long limbs ending in sharp claws. The creature advanced slowly toward me, while children's voices whispered in an ancient language. In its elongated arms it carried the doll, whose eyes now glowed with the same supernatural light. "You freed us," the creature whispered in my mind. "Now we are part of you, and you are part of us." I rose unsteadily and turned on all the lights in the room. My body was soaked in cold sweat, my heart racing. I looked at the table where I had left the doll. It wasn't there. "Impossible," I murmured, frantically searching the room. Maybe it had fallen, or I had put it away without remembering. I ransacked the drawers, looked under the bed, checked my suitcase. Then I heard it. Faint at first, then more distinct. The same rhythmic whisper that Elena had captured in her recording. It was coming from the bathroom. With trembling hands, I picked up the lamp as an improvised weapon and slowly opened the bathroom door. The light was off, but in the faint reflection of the mirror, I could see the doll's silhouette, sitting perfectly upright on the edge of the bathtub. I turned on the light in a sudden movement. The doll was exactly as I had left it on the table. Black, bead eyes, neutral expression, ritualistic clothes. Except that now it was in the bathroom, a place where I certainly had not put it. "I'm losing my mind," I whispered, picking up the doll. It seemed heavier somehow and strangely warm to the touch, as if it had a life of its own. That morning during breakfast, I noticed that everyone looked exhausted, with deep, dark circles under their eyes. "Nightmares," Marco explained when I asked if he was okay. I dreamed about that basement and about eyes watching me. Gabriel and Elena exchanged glances. "Me too," they both admitted almost simultaneously. Something was wrong, very wrong. The skepticism that had defined me throughout my career was beginning to falter in the face of too many coincidences. "I had a similar dream," I confessed. "And the doll, it wasn't where I left it this morning." "We have to return it," Elena insisted, "and seal that box again. Something isn't right." I reluctantly agreed. "Let's finish the filming today and return everything to its place. Then let's get out of here." Back at the House of Cañitas, the feeling of discomfort was palpable. Our equipment began to fail inexplicably. Fully charged batteries drained in minutes. Recordings corrupted with static and those whispers in an unknown language. In the middle of the afternoon, Marco let out a cry of pain upstairs, where he was filming alone. We ran to find him sitting on the floor of an empty room, the camera fallen at his side, his hand pressing his neck. "Something attacked me," he murmured, removing his hand to reveal red marks, small, like children's fingers, but deep enough to leave bruises. I felt as if someone was strangling me. "We should leave," Gabriel insisted. "Now." "Not without returning the doll first," Elena argued. "We have to undo what we started." We agreed, going down to the basement one last time. The atmosphere down there seemed even denser, as if the air had gained substance. The symbols on the central column seemed different, more vivid, almost pulsing in the faint light. The doll, which I was carrying, seemed to vibrate subtly in my hands. When I tried to put it back in the box, my hands locked up. I couldn't open them, as if the doll were stuck to my skin. "I can't let go of it," I confessed, in growing panic. That's when our flashlight began to fail, blinking intermittently. The darkness between flashes, I swore I saw that same silhouette from my nightmare. almost human, but distorted, with limbs too long and those bright eyes fixed on us. "Let's get out of here," I shouted, still struggling with the doll firmly stuck in my hands. We ran out of the house, hurriedly throwing equipment in the car. Marco started the engine, but the car wouldn't move. The wheels spun, but it was as if something invisible kept us anchored there. "What's happening?" Elena shouted, the fear evident in her voice. "We tried for almost an hour. We called mechanics who found nothing wrong. We called taxis which never arrived. We tried to walk away from the house only to discover that, regardless of the direction we took, we ended up returning to the same place, facing the House of Cañitas. We're trapped here," Gabriel concluded, his face pale with the realization. "The house, or whatever is in it, won't let us leave." Desperate, we decided to seek help. We found a local medium, Senora Vasquez, a frail-looking elderly woman with intense, perceptive eyes. After hearing our story, she visibly paled. "You have no idea what you've done," she whispered, observing the doll that now, inexplicably, I could hold normally again. "This is not an ordinary doll. It's a tepalcate, a receptacle for spirits. The ancient priests used them to imprison malevolent entities." "What kind of entities?" I asked, my voice trembling. "A very ancient and powerful one. The Aztecs called it Black Tezcatlipoca, a corrupted aspect of a deity that feeds on human souls. They say it appeared as a shadow with bright eyes whispering promises and threats. The description was identical to what we were seeing, to what we were dreaming. The House of Cañitas was built over an ancient sacrificial temple," the lady continued. "Local stories say the entity was imprisoned there by priests, using human sacrifices to create a mystical seal. The doll was part of that seal, a container, to keep part of the entity's essence contained. And we broke the seal," I concluded, horrified. "Not just that. You removed the receptacle from its place of power. The seal must be completely broken now." "What can we do?" Marco asked. The marks on his neck now a dark purple. The medium looked at us with sadness. "You need to remake the seal. Return the doll and recite the containment ritual. But I warn you, the entity will fight. It has already tasted you. It already knows your fears." We returned to the house at a nightfall, armed with instructions from the medium and the few ritual items she could provide. Purified salt, dried herbs, black candles. The doll, now kept in a consecrated cloth, seemed to vibrate constantly, as if trying to escape. The House of Cañitas looked different in the darkness. Larger, somehow older. The shadows on the walls moved in impossible ways, as if they had a will of their own. And everywhere, that childish whisper in an unknown language. In the basement, the central column now visibly pulsed with a sickly bluish light. The symbols glowed, and the ground around seemed to move as if the earth were breathing. "Quick," I directed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Marco, draw the salt circle. Gabriel, light the candles at the cardinal points. Elena, prepare the herbs." While they followed my instructions, I took the doll from the cloth. Its bead eyes now glowed with the same bluish light as the column, and I felt as if it were looking directly into my soul. "Start reciting the words," I instructed, opening the paper where the medium had written the ancient ritual in Nahuatl. Our voices trembled as we pronounced the strange guttural words. With each syllable, the light in the column intensified, and the shadows around became more agitated. That's when we heard the first scream, high-pitched, childlike, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The ground began to shake, slightly. "Continue," I shouted above the growing noise. The candles exploded into blue flames, much higher than normal. The salt circle began to glow, and on the walls, the shadows converged, taking shape. That same distorted silhouette from my nightmares. The temperature plummeted. Our breath formed clouds in the now freezing air. The doll in my hands became so cold it burned my skin, but I couldn't let go of it. Then something impossible happened. The doll's eyes blinked. Its head slowly turned to look directly at me, independent of my hands. And it smiled. A smile that no doll should be capable of, too wide, full of sharp teeth that weren't there before. I let out a scream, trying to drop it, but it was too late. The doll moved like something alive, jumping from my hands to the floor. And as we watched, paralyzed with horror, it began to grow, its form changing, expanding, until it became the same distorted silhouette from the shadows, except that now it was solid, real. The creature was approximately 2 meters tall, with disproportionately long limbs and skin that looked like solidified shadow. Its eyes glowed like blue beacons in the darkness, and when it opened its mouth, it revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. "You freed me," its voice reverberated in our minds. "Now your souls are mine." Marco was the first to be attacked. The creature moved with impossible speed, its elongated claws piercing his chest before any of us could react. There was a bluish glow, as if something were being extracted from his body, and then he fell, his eyes empty and lifeless. Gabriel screamed, trying to run, but the shadows on the walls came to life, grabbing him like tentacles and dragging him into the darkness. His screams were abruptly silenced. "The circle!" Elena shouted desperately. "We need to complete the ritual." The medium had warned us that the ritual required a voluntary sacrifice, freely offered blood. I took the ritual dagger, determined to do whatever was necessary, but Elena was faster. "Forgive me, Daniela," she whispered, deeply cutting her own wrist and letting the blood fall on the open box of the doll. "Complete the ritual, now." While the creature advanced toward us, I frantically recited the final words of the ritual. Elena's blood glowed with its own light as it flowed into the box. The pain on her face gave way to a serene, almost transcendental expression. "Close the box," she murmured. "Seal it with the wax." The creature let out an inhuman howl of rage when it understood what we were doing. It lunged in our direction, but it was as if an invisible barrier contained it. Its claws stopped inches from my face. With trembling hands, I closed the box and poured the wax over the join, reciting the final words. The creature began to writhe, its body distorting, being pulled as if by an invisible force back into the box. "You are still mine," it whispered in my mind as it was compressed, reduced, sucked into the interior of the receptacle. "I will always be a part of you." The glowing eyes were the last thing to disappear, fixed on me until the last moment. When I finally sealed the box, Elena had already lost too much blood. I held her in my arms as the life drained from her. "Put it back," she whispered, "in the niche, and never come back." Those were her last words. I gently placed Elena's body on the floor, silent tears running down my face. Marco and Gabriel were dead. Elena had sacrificed herself to save me. And why? Because of my arrogance, my skepticism, my stupid curiosity. I returned the sealed box to the niche in the wall, exactly as we had found it. But even with the seal remade, I felt something was wrong. The air was still heavy, charged with a malevolent presence. The shadows still moved in an unnatural way, and the whispers had not ceased. I staggered up the stairs, leaving behind the bodies of my friends. There was no way to explain 3 deaths to the authorities. There was no way to explain anything that had happened. And something told me I needed to get out of there immediately. On the upper floor, the shadows seemed to follow me, stretching across the walls like fingers trying to reach me. The whispers increased, no longer childlike, but angry, threatening. I reached the front door, but it wouldn't open, locked by some invisible force. The windows resisted any attempt to break them, as if made of unbreakable material. "You're not going anywhere," that voice whispered in my mind. "The seal is remade, but I have already tasted your soul. Part of me lives in you now." It was then that I understood the terrible truth. The ritual had contained the entity and the doll again, but our connection was already established. As long as I lived, it would have a link to this world. Through me, it would eventually find a way back. There was only one solution. In the basement, I took the ritual candles and spread them throughout the house, pouring the consecrated oil the medium had given us over them. The old wood of the structure would catch fire easily. "What are you doing?" the voice whispered, now alarmed. "Finishing what we started," I replied aloud. "If I can't seal you completely, then I'll destroy your portal to this world." I lit the first candle, then the second. The flames caught quickly, spreading through the rooms. The shadows on the walls agitated frantically, trying to extinguish the fire, but without success. The whispers transformed into shouts of anger. I went down to the basement one last time, observing the sealed box. Even through the seal, I could feel the entity's fury, its impotence in the face of what I was doing. "You're coming with me," I murmured, picking up the box. The fire had already taken over the upper floor when I went up again. The smoke was dense, the flames high. The structure was beginning to groan, wood crackling under the intense heat. Walked to the center of the main room, the box pressed against my chest. The shadows formed one last time, those bright eyes materializing in the smoke. "If I die, you lose your link to this world," I declared, "and I'll take your receptacle with me." The entity let out a howl of rage so intense that the windows exploded. Finally, a way out. But it was too late. The ceiling began to collapse, flaming beams falling around me. I ran to the broken window, throwing the box outside seconds before the ceiling completely collapsed. The last thing I remember is a violent impact and then darkness. I woke up 3 weeks later in Mexico City Municipal Hospital. I had suffered severe burns, a serious concussion, and smoke inhalation. The doctors called my survival a miracle. The police had questions, of course. Many questions. 3 dead in a mysterious fire. My story about a filming session gone wrong was met with skepticism, but without evidence of a crime, the case was eventually filed as a tragic accident. The owner, Mr. Rodriguez, refused to rebuild the house. The land remains, empty to this day, fenced off and abandoned. As for the box with the doll, it was never found. Firefighters, police officers, investigators, nobody saw it. It disappeared as if it had never existed. But I know the truth. It exists, and it's waiting. I see it in my dreams every night, those bright eyes watching me from the shadows. I hear the whispers when I'm alone. Sometimes I see reflections in the mirror that aren't mine, a distorted face smiling with teeth that are too sharp. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychiatrists try to medicate me, but medications can't cure what I have because I'm not crazy. I'm marked. The entity may be contained again, its receptacle lost somewhere unknown. But as it promised, part of it lives in me now. And through me, it watches, waits, plans. Sometimes I find myself writing in my diary only to discover later that I've written in a language I don't know. Ancient symbols, Nahuatl words. Sometimes I wake up in different rooms than where I slept, with no memory of how I got there. And the eyes. The eyes are everywhere now, in the shadows of my room, in the reflection of the turned-off television, in the darkness when I close my eyes. I don't know how much time I have before it finds a new way back. I don't know if what I did at the House of Cañitas was enough. I only know that as long as I live, it will never be truly imprisoned. And when I die, well, perhaps that's when it will finally claim what it considers its rightful due. My soul. Story 3. The Door That Never Closes and the Children's Whispers. My name is Marco Delgado, PhD in anthropology with a specialization in Mesoamerican civilizations. I've dedicated my academic life to studying Aztec rituals and their connections to the supernatural. I always maintained scientific distance, observing, documenting, analyzing. I never truly believed in the mystical aspects of what I studied until I bought the House of Cañitas. I knew the stories, of course. Carlos Trejo's book, the accounts of unexplained deaths, the apparitions. For most of my colleagues, they were just folkloric exaggerations or fabrications to sell books. For me, they represented a unique opportunity for ethnographic research on the development of modern urban legends. The house had changed hands several times in the last few decades, each owner selling it for a fraction of its real value after short periods of occupation. When I acquired it in 2018, it was again abandoned after a fire that had partially destroyed the upper floor. The reconstruction was expensive, but necessary for my plans to transform the place into a personal research center on paranormal phenomena reported at sites of pre-Columbian importance. Lucia, my girlfriend of 3 years, was the only one to, support me when my university colleagues laughed at my obsession with ghosts. An art historian specializing in indigenous iconography, she shared my fascination with the place, although she maintained a healthy skepticism about the supernatural stories. I find it fascinating that you're willing to risk your academic reputation for this, she commented as we unloaded the last boxes on moving day. But I have to admit that this place has a strange energy. I ignored the comment. I attributed any feeling of discomfort to the influence of the stories we all knew. Psychological suggestion, nothing more. The first weeks were dedicated to organization. I transformed the living room into an office, with shelves for my extensive collection of books on Mesoamerican occultism, and an entire wall to map patterns of paranormal events reported in the region. The second floor became our personal living space. And then there was the basement. The entrance to it was under the main staircase. A small door, strangely disproportionate to the rest of the modern architecture of the rebuilt house. The basement itself seemed to have survived intact all the fires and renovations that the property had undergone over the centuries. Its walls were of ancient stone, the floor of packed earth, with a central column covered with worn glyphs that I immediately recognized as pre-Columbian Nahuatl. It was on that first night that I noticed something peculiar about the basement door. It refused to stay closed. I locked it before going to bed, only to find it completely open the next morning. It must be the wind, or maybe the house is uneven, Lucia suggested when I mentioned it. Old buildings settle in strange ways. I accepted the explanation and tried again, this time placing a heavy chair against the door. The next morning, the chair was in the same place, but the door was open again, as if it had simply passed through the physical obstacle. Throughout the first week, I tried everything. Changed the lock, applied metal reinforcements, even nailed the door to the frame. Nothing worked. Each morning, inevitably, the door was open, with no signs that the locks had been forced. It was in the second week that the whispers began. Initially, I attributed the sounds to the old structure of the house or the peculiar acoustics of the place. But gradually, they became more distinct, especially at night. Children's voices speaking in a classical Nahuatl that, thanks to my specialization, I could partially understand. Xihualacan. Come, Titectlalpachos. You will free us. Yohuali Tlacatl, the man of the night. As a researcher, I did what any academic would do. I methodically documented everything. I installed recorders in the basement and at the foot of the stairs. I analyzed temperature and humidity patterns. I photographed the door at regular intervals to document its position. The recordings captured the whispers with surprising clarity, ruling out any explanation that they were mere psychological suggestion. Even more disturbing, some recordings contained whispers when the house was completely empty, during periods when Lucia and I were at the university. "This is extraordinary," I commented as I played the recordings for Lucia. "We are possibly documenting one of the most convincing cases of paranormal activity ever recorded." Lucia didn't share my enthusiasm. "Marco, doesn't this seem dangerous?" "To you, these voices are talking about freeing something. It's fascinating from a linguistic standpoint," I argued. "They're using post-classical era Nahuatl structures, consistent with 15th century Aztec rituals. If this is some kind of residual manifestation, it could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and its persistence after physical death." As I dove deeper into the research, Lucia became progressively more uncomfortable in the house. She reported recurring nightmares with hollow-eyed children surrounding her bed, whispering about a fallen god waiting in the shadows. "Sometimes I see things, Marco," she confessed one night. "Shadows that move in unnatural ways. A figure watching from dark corners with eyes that glow." I attributed her reports to the influence of the stories about the house and the atmosphere of our research, a mistake for which I will never forgive myself. In my investigations of the basement, I focused primarily on the central column with the glyphs. Over time, I managed to partially translate the inscriptions. They referred to a place of imprisonment, a portal sealed by sacrifice. They mentioned an entity called Black Tezcatlipoca, a corrupted aspect of an Aztec deity, imprisoned through the sacrifice of children whose voices would maintain the seal intact as they echoed in the threshold between worlds. The more I learned, the more obsessed I became. I started sleeping little, preferring to work at night when the whispers were clearer. I began to respond to them in Nahuatl, trying to establish some kind of communication. And they responded. The first direct response came on a new moon night. I was alone in the basement, Lucia having decided to spend the night at her sister's house after an argument about my unhealthy obsession, as she called it. "Tleka timotetlatia?" I asked the void. "Why do you hide?" The silence that followed was deeper than any natural silence, as if even the ambient sound had been absorbed. Then, distinctly, a voice responded. It wasn't childlike like the others, but deep, reverberating, speaking a Nahuatl so ancient that I had difficulty understanding it completely. "Amo nimotlatia, nimitchia." I do not hide. I wait for you. The temperature in the basement dropped so rapidly that my breath formed a dense cloud. The darkest corner, where the light from my flashlight barely reached, two luminescent points appeared, like eyes watching from within darkness itself. I should have felt fear. Any rational person would have fled. But what I felt was an almost intoxicating academic excitement. I had established direct contact with something that defied all conventional scientific explanation. That's when the wall behind the central column partially collapsed, revealing a hidden compartment that centuries of previous occupants had never discovered. The hidden compartment was small, not much larger than a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in agave fiber cloth preserved by the dry environment, I found a partially burned codex, an authentic Aztec manuscript, with pages made of amate fiber folded in accordion style covered with colored pictograms. My hands trembled as I carefully removed the artifact. It was a monumental archaeological discovery, a pre-Columbian codex never before catalogued, preserved for centuries in surprisingly good condition. Working with extreme care, I photographed each page before attempting any greater manipulation. The illustrations were vivid and disturbing. They showed priests performing rituals in a temple, whose layout exactly matched the foundation of the House of Cañitas. The images detailed the imprisonment of a dark entity with bright eyes, using the sacrifice of 7 children whose souls, represented as small spirals of smoke leaving their bodies, formed a mystical seal. A series of pictograms showed the entity, referred to as Black Tezcatlipoca, repeatedly trying to escape over the centuries, only to be contained by the eternal echo of the sacrificed children's voices, the last intact. Page contained a clear warning. If the seal were broken, the entity would escape to feed again, consuming souls to regain its full power. I spent days translating the codex, sleeping only when exhaustion overcame me. When Lucia returned, she found me in a deplorable state. Unshaven, bloodshot eyes, feeding myself only on coffee and quick snacks. "Marco, you need to stop," she pleaded, genuinely alarmed by my appearance. "This is consuming you." "You don't understand the importance of this," I replied, irritated by the interruption. "This manuscript proves that the events reported in this house have a real historical basis. I'm documenting a phenomenon that directly links ancient Aztec religious practices to contemporary paranormal manifestations. Look at yourself," she exclaimed. "You're unrecognizable. You hardly sleep, barely eat. You talk to yourself when you think I'm not listening. And those marks on your neck." Automatically, my hand went to my neck, covering the scratches that I had attributed to some nocturnal accident. I didn't mention to Lucia that they appeared every morning, always 3 parallel marks, as if made by claws. "It's just stress," I lied. "Academic work can be physically demanding." "It's not just that," she insisted, lowering her voice as if afraid of being heard. "There's something wrong with this house, Marco. Something that's changing you. Since you found that manuscript, you act as if you were under some kind of influence." She wasn't wrong. I felt the change in myself, a growing obsession with the manuscript, with the whispers, with the entity described in the ancient illustrations. Sometimes I caught myself staring into the darkness for hours, conversing in Nahuatl with something that only I seemed to see. The nights became particularly intense. The childish whispers were now constant, like a distorted lullaby that never ceased. The basement door not only refused to stay closed, sometimes it opened violently as if pushed by an invisible force. And there were always the eyes, those luminescent points that watched from the shadows, becoming more distinct, more frequent each day. 2 weeks after finding the codex, I made a discovery that changed everything. In a specific sequence of pictograms that I initially interpreted as part of the imprisonment ritual, I identified what appeared to be a reverse ritual, a method to completely free the entity. Unlike the original imprisonment, which had required the forced sacrifice of innocent children, the liberation required a voluntary sacrifice, blood freely offered by someone who would become the physical receptacle for the entity's return to the world. The idea should have horrified me. Instead, I found myself fascinated, contemplating the academic possibilities of documenting the complete manifestation process. That's when Lucia found my notes on the liberation ritual. Her reaction was one of absolute horror. "You're not actually considering doing this, are you?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "Of course not," I lied again, although I had already begun to gather the necessary materials, specific herbs, pigments for the ritual symbols, an obsidian blade for the ceremonial cut. "Marco, we need to leave this house," she insisted. "Something is influencing you, manipulating you. This is no longer academic research, it's dangerous." "I can't abandon this now," I replied, growing irritation in my voice. "I'm about to make the greatest anthropological discovery in history. Prove the existence of phenomena that Western science has rejected for centuries." Our discussion escalated to a serious fight. Lucia threatened to call my university colleagues to alert them about my mental state. She mentioned seeking psychiatric help for me. "You won't ruin this," I growled, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Not now that I'm so close." Lucia's gaze changed. It was no longer just concern, but genuine fear. Fear of me. "You're not the Marco I know," she whispered, slowly backing away. "Something has taken over you. That night I made a decision I never imagined being capable of. While Lucia slept, I changed the lock on the front door, effectively trapping her outside when she left for the university in the morning. Part of me, the part that was still the rational Marco, the academic, screamed that this was madness. But that voice was becoming weaker each day, muffled by the constant whispers that filled my mind, by the promise of knowledge that no living being had ever possessed. In the morning, after Lucia left, I began preparations for the ritual. I drew on the earthen floor of the basement the symbols extracted from the codex, using natural pigments mixed with my own blood. I lit black candles at the cardinal points. I placed the central column as an altar, upon which I placed the obsidian blade. The whispers increased in intensity, now accompanied by a visible pulsation in the shadows around. The temperature dropped dramatically, but I barely felt the cold, consumed by the fever of anticipation. I began to recite the words of the ritual, each Nahuatl syllable reverberating through the ancient walls, as if the air itself responded. With each phrase, the symbols on the floor glowed with their own light, not reflected but emanated from within. That's when the basement door exploded outward, torn from its hinges. Lucia was there, accompanied by an elderly man I had never seen. "Marco, stop!" she shouted, horror in her eyes when she saw what I had prepared. The man at her side stepped forward. Although elderly, his eyes conveyed immense strength and knowledge. "My name is Carlos Trejo," he said calmly, as if addressing a frightened child or a dangerous animal. "And you are about to make a terrible mistake." Chapter 3. The confrontation of worlds. I recognized the name immediately. Carlos Trejo, the man who decades ago had written about the horrors of the House of Cañitas, widely ridiculed as a fabulist seeking fame. Except that now, looking into his aged but alert eyes, I saw something that no book photograph had captured. The look of someone who had faced the inexplicable and survived to tell the story. "You have no idea what you're invoking," he continued, observing the symbols on the floor. "This entity is not a research subject or an academic curiosity. It's something ancient and evil that feeds on human souls." "It speaks to me," I replied, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "It shows me things that no one else can see. Knowledge lost for centuries." "That's how it seduces," Trejo explained, taking a cautious step into the basement. "It promises knowledge, power, revelations. But the price is your humanity. Something inside me, a part that was still the real Marco, recognized the truth in his words. But it was so distant now, so weak compared to the voice that constantly whispered in my mind, promising revelations beyond human comprehension. "How did you know?" I asked Lucia, feeling a pang of betrayal. "The marks on your neck," she replied, tears in her eyes. "I researched online and found similar accounts. They all mentioned Carlos Trejo. It took me days to convince him to come. Or years trying to forget," Trejo murmured. 40 years waking up with nightmares, seeing those eyes in the shadows. And here we are again." While they spoke, I silently continued the ritual, moving the obsidian blade to my wrist. Just a few drops of voluntarily offered blood, and the portal would be open. That's when something unimaginable happened. The basement door, the door that never stayed closed, began to change. The frame where it had been attached was no longer a simple opening to the upper floor, but expanded, grew, becoming a portal to somewhere else. Through the opening I glimpsed not the house, but a shimmering void where childlike figures danced like shadows, their voices now perfectly clear, singing in Nahuatl about the god who would return. And beyond them, something larger moved. A mass of darkness with those same bright eyes that had been watching me for weeks. "The portal is opening," Trejo warned, panic in his voice. "The symbols you drew, you're not containing the entity. You're inviting it in." I looked at the codex, at my translations, and realized my terrible mistake. What I had interpreted as a liberation ritual was actually a warning. An example of what should never be done. The entity's influence had distorted my understanding, manipulating me to completely break the seal myself. "He's no longer in control," Lucia said to Trejo, observing my robotized movements as I continued the ritual despite my growing awareness. Trejo nodded gravely. "The influence is too strong now. We need to forcibly interrupt the ritual." He advanced toward me, but something inside me, something that was no longer me, reacted with superhuman speed and strength. I grabbed him by the neck, lifting him off the ground with impossible ease. "Marco, no!" Lucia shouted, running in our direction. For a moment I glimpsed my reflection in Trejo's terrified eyes. My own eyes now glowed with the same supernatural light I had seen in the shadows. My face was contorted in an expression I didn't recognize. Something in his gaze momentarily broke the entity's control. I released him, staggering backward, fighting against the influence that dominated my mind. "The ritual," I stammered, finding my own voice for an instant. "How do I stop it?" Trejo, catching his breath, replied urgently. "The original seal was created with forced sacrifice of innocence. But there is a counter-ritual, a voluntary sacrifice made with love, not fear. more powerful than the original. He began to recite words in Nahuatl, not the same ones from the Codex, but an older, more powerful variation. With each word, the Bime, symbols I had drawn on the floor lost their glow, and the door portal seemed to tremble, like an image in disturbed water. The entity realized what was happening. An inhuman roar echoed through the portal, and tendrils of pure darkness extended, grabbing Trejo and throwing him against the wall with brutal force. "Carlos!" Lucia shouted, running to him. The elderly man was conscious, but severely injured. Blood flowed from a cut on his forehead, but he continued murmuring the counter-ritual words, each syllable visibly requiring enormous effort. The influence over me momentarily weakened with the interruption of the original ritual. I struggled to regain control to help Trejo and Lucia, but the entity, sensing my resistance, intensified its dominance. "Finish what I started," Trejo gasped to Lucia, his voice weak. "The counter-ritual requires voluntary sacrifice, born of love." Then, to my horror, Lucia took the obsidian blade from the altar. Her eyes met mine, not with fear or anger, but with serene determination and a love I didn't deserve. "The ritual requires a receptor," she said softly. "Someone to take the place of the children whose souls maintain the seal. Someone who offers themselves voluntarily." "No," I pleaded, momentarily freed by the sight of the blade in her hand. "Lucia, don't do this, it's not worth it." "Yes, it is," she replied with a sad smile. "Because it's not just for you, Marco, it's for everyone. This thing cannot be unleashed on the world." The entity sensed the danger. The shadow tendrils launched again through the portal, this time toward Lucia. Gathering strength I didn't know I possessed, I intercepted them, grabbing them with my own hands. The pain was instant and overwhelming, like liquid fire running through my veins. "Run!" I shouted to Lucia, holding the violently writhing tendrils. Instead, she moved to the center of the basement, directly under the now fully open portal above. The childlike figures danced frantically around her, their chants becoming desperate screams. "I love you, Marco," she said, silent tears running down her face. "Find your way back." Before I could react, she deeply cut her wrist with the blade and raised her arm, allowing her blood to fall directly into the center of the symbols on the floor. "I offer myself voluntarily as a receptacle," she declared in a loud, clear voice. "My soul for the seal, my love for the prison." A blinding light exploded from the wound, not red like blood, but white and pure. The shadow tendrils recoiled as if burned. The entity emitted a scream of pure rage that reverberated in dimensions beyond our comprehension. "Lucia!" "No!" I shouted, struggling to reach her, but an invisible force kept me immobilized. Trejo, still leaning against the wall, continued the counter-ritual with renewed strength, his words now synchronized with Lucia's sacrifice. The symbols on the floor changed, reorganizing into a different pattern, glowing with the same white light that emanated from Lucia's blood. The portal began to contract, the childlike figures converging on Lucia as if attracted by a magnet. She was floating now, her feet inches from the ground, her body arched in silent pain as the light intensified. The mass of darkness beyond the portal, the true form of the entity, desperately lunged against the increasingly smaller opening, its bright eyes now frenetically furious. But for each lunge, the portal diminished more rapidly. With one last look at me, full of love, forgiveness, and a peace that transcended our reality, Lucia was pulled into the portal, taking with her the childlike figures and the light itself. For an instant, she seemed to transform into pure energy, merging with the very fabric of the seal. Then, with a deafening boom, the portal closed completely. The force that had kept me immobilized disappeared, and I fell to my knees, a cry of pure anguish escaping my throat. The basement door was again just an ordinary door, except that now, for the first time since I had known it, it remained firmly closed. The silence that followed was absolute. The whispers had ceased. The oppressive presence that permeated the house was absent. Only the sound of my crying and Trejo's weak breathing filled the environment. "She's gone," I murmured, incredulous. "She sacrificed herself because of me." "No," Trejo weakly replied, managing to sit up against the wall. "She sacrificed herself for all of us. What she did was more powerful than any previous ritual. A voluntary sacrifice born of love, not fear or coercion. It's the strongest possible seal." I took him to the hospital, inventing a story about a domestic accident. While waiting for news about his condition, I felt strangely empty, as if part of me had been torn away along with the entity's influence. When Trejo regained consciousness the next day, I asked for explanations. How did he know so much? How had he survived the first encounter with the entity decades ago? "I spent 40 years researching," he explained, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Learning everything I could about Black Tezcatlipoca, about Aztec, rituals, about imprisoning entities. What you discovered in months took me decades to fully understand. The entity. Is it really contained now?" Trejo's expression became grave. "Temporarily. Lucia's sacrifice bought time. Decades, perhaps even a century. But entities like this cannot be destroyed, only contained. Eventually the seal will weaken again." "And when that happens?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Someone will have to be prepared to renew the seal," he replied somberly. "Someone with knowledge to recognize the signs and strength to resist the influence." 5 years have passed since that night. The House of Cañitas remains sealed. Not just the basement door, but the entire property. No one lives there now. The windows are nailed shut, the entrance blocked with concrete. Carlos Trejo passed away peacefully last year, leaving me his files, his research, his knowledge. The burden is now mine. I still dream of Lucia every night. Sometimes they are nightmares where I see her being consumed by darkness. Other times they are comforting dreams where she assures me she is at peace, that the sacrifice was worth it. Have not returned to academia. Instead, I travel the world documenting other places similar to the House of Cañitas, places where the veil between worlds is thin, where ancient rituals have left doors ajar for entities that should remain dormant. Always carry 2 things with me: a photograph of Lucia and the partially burned codex. One to remind me of what I lost, the other to remind me of what I must prevent. Because the truth I learned is this: there are things in this world that exist at the boundaries of human understanding. Entities older than our civilization, that feed on our fear, our curiosity, our ambition.